On a hilltop just outside Philadelphia, 100 years ago, men raised a house so large it was bigger than the White House. Not a hotel, not a museum, a private home, one family, 147 rooms, 45 bathrooms, 6 full stories of stone and marble, and a footprint that swallowed 100,000 square feet of Pennsylvania hillside. They called it the American Versailles, and when you stood at the bottom of its drive and looked up, that name did not feel like an exaggeration. It felt like an understatement. But here is the question that matters. This was not built in our age of tower cranes and hydraulic lifts and steel that arrives cut to the inch. This was built starting in 1916 by hand, by horse, in the middle of a world war that choked off half the materials they needed. So how? How did one man raise the grandest palace this country had ever seen, in an age that had barely learned to pour concrete? That is the story. Not why it fell, though it did fall, and we will get there. The story is how it went up. To understand the house, you first have to understand the man who wanted it, because a house like this is never really about the house. It is about the man. His name was Edward Townsend Stotesbury. Everyone called him Ned. And Ned Stotesbury did not begin life rich. He was born in 1849 into an ordinary Philadelphia family, the kind that counted its dollars at the end of the week. As a young man, he took a clerk's job at a banking house called Drexel & Company, the lowest rung there was, and he began to climb. He climbed for the rest of his life. He was sharp, tireless, and he had a gift for money that other men simply did not have. Drexel & Company tied itself to a rising name on Wall Street, the House of J.P. Morgan, and by 1883, Ned Stotesbury was a partner in the most powerful financial empire in America. By the height of his life, his fortune was counted at around $100 million. Sit with that number, in the money of a century ago. In today's dollars, it runs close to $2 billion. He was, without argument, the richest man in Philadelphia. But money alone did not build Whitemarsh Hall. A woman did. In 1912, Ned Stotesbury, already past 60, married his second wife, Eva. Eva was ambitious, elegant, and hungry for a stage. She wanted to entertain the great families of America, to host senators and ambassadors and royalty. And the townhouse the couple kept near Rittenhouse Square, grand as it was simply not large enough for the world she intended to command. So the house that rose on that hilltop was, in the truest sense, a gift. A wedding present from an aging financier to the wife who wanted a palace. And Ned Stotesbury, a man who had spent 70 years proving he belonged among the giants, was more than happy to build one. He wanted it to say something. That American money was now the equal of any king's. That a boy who started as a clerk could end his life in a house that rivaled the palaces of Europe. This was not going to be a large home. It was going to be a statement carved in stone. And to carve it, he needed the finest architect in the country. He found him in a man named Horace Trumbauer. And Trumbauer, like Stotesbury, was a self-made story. He had almost no formal schooling in architecture. He had started as an office boy in a firm and taught himself the trade from the ground up, and he rose on raw talent alone to become one of the most sought-after architects in America. If you have ever seen the great columned face of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you have seen Horace Trumbauer's hand. But there is a name behind Trumbauer's name that the history books buried for too long. His chief designer, the man whose pencil shaped much of Whitemarsh Hall's beauty, was Julian Abel. Abele was one of the first formally trained African-American architects in the country, brilliant, French-educated, and for decades his genius went uncredited under his employer's signature. When you look at the elegance of Whitemarsh Hall, at its proportion and its restraint, you are very often looking at the mind of Julian Abel. Together, they chose their style. Not the heavy fortress look of some rich men's houses, but a Georgian palace in the English manner, calm and symmetrical, its wings folding back into a U around a private inner court. It would look, from the front, like the country seat of an English duke. If an English duke had somehow been given an American fortune and told to spend it all. And they chose the ground with care. The house would not sit down in the landscape, it would sit on top of it, crowning a hill, so that it could be seen from far off and could look down over everything it owned. To design the gardens that would flow down that hill in terraces and fountains and mile-long avenues of green, they brought in a Frenchman, Jacques Greber, one of the great landscape designers of the age. None of this happened quickly, and that is the first thing people misunderstand about a house like this. A palace is not sketched in an afternoon. For months, the drawings flowed out of Trumbauer's office, floor plan after floor plan, elevation after elevation. Every column and cornice and staircase worked out on paper long before anyone touched the ground. Eva herself leaned over those drawings, shaping the rooms she would rule. And it was Abel, more than anyone, who translated a rich couple's ambition into architecture that actually held together, that had balance and proportion and grace. The stack of blueprints that survives from those years is itself a monument. Hundreds of sheets, the entire palace imagined down to the last handrail before a single stone was cut. The plans were drawn. The vision was set. In 1916, the work began, and almost immediately, the world tried to stop it. Because to put a palace on top of a hill, you must first remake the hill. Before a single stone was laid, armies of men and horses and steam shovels went to work moving the earth itself, carving the hilltop into the shape the plans demanded, cutting the terraces, grading the long approach. This alone was a feat. Tons upon tons of Pennsylvania soil shifted by muscle and early machine. Months of labor before the house even existed as a hole in the ground. Then, they began to dig down. And this is the first secret of how Whitemarsh Hall was truly built, the part almost no one sees in the photographs. The house had 6 stories, but 3 of those 6 stories were underground. What stood above the earth was the palace, the ballrooms, and the marble halls and the bedrooms. But beneath it, buried in the hill, was a second building just as large, a hidden industrial world that made the palace above it possible. Because a house this size, this far from the city, could not simply plug into the world around it. It had to become its own world. Down in those buried floors was the machinery of a small town. The estate generated its own electricity from its own power plant, humming away beneath the marble. It had its own water system, its own heating, sending warmth up through 6 stories of stone. It even ran its own telephone exchange, with its own operator sitting at a switchboard, connecting calls inside a private home as if it were a hotel. The palace that dazzled the guests above was, in truth, floating on top of a machine. That is the thing to understand about Whitemarsh Hall. What you saw was only half of it. The other half was hidden in the hill, doing the invisible work of keeping a fantasy alive. And getting that hidden half into the ground was a war of its own. To carry 6 stories of stone, the foundations had to be sunk deep and massive into the reshaped hilltop, a vast base of masonry and concrete strong enough to hold a palace steady for centuries. Everything had to be hauled up that hill to the site. The stone, the timber, the sand, the cement, the iron, load after load after load, month after month. In an age when much of that hauling still ended with horses and men and sheer stubborn effort. There was no shortcut. A house this size, in 1916, was built the way the pyramids were built, one heavy piece at a time, by hands that knew the weight of what they carried. Now, back above ground, they faced the enemy that nearly beat them: the war. The First World War was tearing across Europe exactly as construction began, and Europe was where the great houses of America got their finery. The marble, the tapestries, the carved stone, the old world craftsmanship, all of it came across the ocean, and the war slammed that door shut. Ships that once carried Italian marble now carried soldiers. The supply lines Trumbauer was counting on simply vanished. So they adapted, the way great builders always do. For the vast exterior, instead of waiting on European stone that might never come, they turned to American stone. They clad the entire enormous face of the house in Indiana limestone, a pale, luminous stone quarried from the American Midwest. And it is that stone that gave Whitemarsh Hall its glow. From a distance in the sun, the whole palace seemed to shine white. And then there were the columns. Across the front of the house stood a row of monumental columns in the Greek manner, each one 50 feet tall, carved from limestone. Think about what that meant with the tools of 1917. Each column had to be quarried, shaped, moved across the country, hauled up that long hill, and then raised upright and set perfectly into place, without the hydraulic cranes we would use today. It was done with rail, with cable, with block and tackle, with steam power, and the coordinated strength of a great many men who knew exactly what they were doing. Every one of those 50-foot columns going up was, in itself, a small engineering triumph. And behind the stone came the craftsmen. An undertaking like this pulled in whole armies of skilled hands, stone cutters and masons and plasterers, iron workers, wood carvers, artisans, many of them trained in the old European traditions, all converging on one Pennsylvania hilltop to build one man's dream. For 5 years, that hill was one of the busiest and most ambitious construction sites in the country. The war slowed everything. What might have taken 3 years stretched toward 5, but slowly, stone by stone, the palace climbed out of the ground. By the end of the war in 1918, the great shell of the house stood finished against the sky. By 1920, the family could move partly in while the finishing work went on around them. And in 1921, after 5 long years, Whitemarsh Hall was complete. So let us walk through what those 5 years actually produced, because the scale of it still does not feel real, even when you say the numbers out loud. 147 rooms, 45 bathrooms, at a time when an ordinary American family shared one, if they had one at all. 100,000 square feet of floor space, which, to put it plainly, made this private home larger than the White House itself. Inside, 3 separate elevators carried the family and staff between the floors. There was a ballroom 64 feet long, built to hold the great parties Eva had dreamed of. There was a pipe organ so enormous it rose through 3 stories of the house. And when it played, its music rolled through every marble hall at once. There was a movie theater inside the home. There was that private telephone system with its own operators. Every luxury the 20th century had just invented, this house had, and had first. Walk in through those front doors and let yourself feel the size of it. You step out of the daylight into a great entrance hall of cool, polished marble, your footsteps echoing up into a ceiling far above your head. Ahead of you, a grand staircase sweeps upward, wide enough for a dozen people to climb side by side. The walls around you are hung with the faces of English lords and ladies in gilded frames, tapestries older than the country you are standing in, marble carved into fireplaces taller than a man. Every hall opens onto another hall, every room onto another room, and you quickly lose count. And then you lose your sense of direction entirely, because no ordinary human being was ever meant to hold 147 rooms in their head. You could live in this house for a year and still find doors you had never opened. Step outside, and the scale only grew. The house sat at the center of some 300 acres of grounds, Graeber's formal gardens fell away from the terraces in a cascade of fountains and clipped hedges and long green avenues. To reach the front door, a visitor turned in at the gatehouse and drove the better part of 2 miles up through the estate before the columns of the house even came into view. Keeping those grounds immaculate took a standing army of 70 gardeners working full-time, aided by a fleet of 20 motorized mowers, at a time when most Americans had never seen a single one. And the cost? The structure itself, the stone and the labor and the engineering, came to around $3 million. But that was only the building. Once you added the furnishings, the imported marble, the tapestries, the art, the gold fixtures, the final figure climbed toward $10 million in the money of that era. Translated into today's dollars, the number runs into the hundreds of millions. How does that measure against the other great houses of the age? Honestly, Whitemarsh Hall was not the single largest private home America ever built. The Vanderbilt's Biltmore, down in North Carolina, was larger. So by a hair was a castle out on Long Island. Whitemarsh ranked as the third largest private residence in the entire United States. But among all of them, it held one title that no other could claim. And that title is the dark thread we will come to at the very end. To feel how rare it was, look at the company it kept. The Vanderbilt's Biltmore, the largest of them all, sprawled across the mountains of North Carolina with 250 rooms. And Whitemarsh Hall was not even alone in its own corner of Pennsylvania. Just a few miles away stood Linwood Hall, the palace of the streetcar magnate Peter Widener, another colossal Trumbauer mansion with more than 100 rooms of its own. For a brief golden moment, the hills outside Philadelphia held a cluster of private palaces unlike anything else in America. Great houses staring at each other across the countryside, each one built by a self-made fortune determined to prove it had truly arrived. Whitemarsh Hall was the grandest of them, the one they called the American Versailles, and even the men who owned the others came to see it and went home a little quieter. For now, hold on to the picture at its peak, because for a few short years in the 1920s, Whitemarsh Hall was not just a building, it was alive. Imagine arriving on one of those nights. Your car turns in at the gate and climbs that long, dark drive, and then the trees fall away and there it is. The entire vast face of the house lit up, floodlit against the night sky, every window burning gold. 600 guests inside, the pipe organ pouring music down from 3 stories up, senators, ambassadors, industrialists, foreign royalty moving through halls hung with the art of Europe. Because Ned Stotesbury had filled his palace with treasure. Guided by the most famous art dealer in the world, Lord Duveen, he had assembled one of the greatest private art collections in America. Old master paintings, English portraits, French antiques, statues and tapestries gathered from the old country and set into this new one. Every room was a small museum. Eva finally had the stage she had wanted, and the whole world came to stand on it. To run it all took a household staff of around 40 inside the house, butlers and maids and cooks and footmen and valets, and those 70 more out in the gardens. A private workforce of over 100 people devoted to the comfort of one family. And here is the quiet irony inside all that grandeur. The Stotesburys did not even live there year-round. Whitemarsh Hall was, in a sense, their spring and autumn home. In winter, they went south to their Palm Beach mansion in Florida. In summer, they went north to their seaside estate in Maine. This colossal palace, this 100,000 square foot wonder that had taken 5 years and a fortune to raise, sat quiet and shuttered for a good part of every year, waiting for its family to return. For most of the Roaring '20s, it hardly seemed to matter. The money kept flowing, the parties kept blazing, and the American Versailles stood at the very peak of the Gilded Age, the highest expression of what private wealth in this country could build. And then, the ground shifted under all of it. In 1929, the stock market collapsed, and the Great Depression came down over America. Suddenly, a flood-lit palace full of 600 guests was not a wonder anymore. To a country standing in bread lines, it looked like an insult. The great parties grew quieter. The criticism grew louder. And Ned Stotesbury, now a very old man, watched the world that had built him begin to come apart. He died in 1938, nearly 90 years old, and with him went the fortune and the will that had held Whitemarsh Hall together. Eva was left with a palace she could not possibly afford to keep. The staff of 100, the 70 gardeners, the power plant, the acres of glass and stone, all of it cost a fortune simply to maintain, and the money to pay for it was gone. She tried to sell it, but who, in the shadow of the Depression, buys a 147-room palace? For years, the greatest private house in Pennsylvania sat on the market and no one came. Finally, in 1943, it sold. A chemical company bought Whitemarsh Hall, the American Versailles, the $10 million dream, for $167,000. A fraction of what it had cost to raise. They turned the marble halls into research laboratories. Ballrooms became office space. The palace of senators and royalty became a place where men in white coats ran chemical tests. There was one last strange moment of glory. During the Second World War, when America feared its cities might be bombed, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York needed somewhere safe to hide its treasures. And so around 90 van loads of priceless artwork were driven quietly out of the city and lowered into the deep, secure, buried basements of Whitemarsh Hall. Those hidden underground floors, built to power a rich man's parties, spent the war guarding some of the most valuable art on Earth. But when the chemical company finally moved out in the 1960s, the long dying began in earnest. The house stood empty. Then, it stood open. Vandals and scavengers moved in. The great carvings were sawn off the walls and carried away. The fixtures were stripped. Weather poured in through broken windows, and the palace that had taken 5 years and armies of craftsmen to build began, room by room, to rot. By the late 1970s, Whitemarsh Hall was listed for sale one final time, for a little over $1 million, and that price was for the land alone. The house, the actual house, the largest private home ever to stand in Pennsylvania, was now counted as worth nothing. Worse than nothing. It was in the way. And so, in 1980, the wrecking ball came. It took a long time to bring it down, because even in ruin, the stone was built to last for centuries. But down it came. And with that, Whitemarsh Hall earned the one grim title it holds above all the other great mansions of America. Biltmore is bigger, but Biltmore still stands. Whitemarsh Hall became the largest private house in the history of the United States ever to be deliberately torn down. Today, if you go to that hilltop outside Philadelphia, you will not find a palace. You will find rows of ordinary townhouses, an ordinary suburban development built over the bones of the American Versailles. But walk a little, and in a small, quiet park among the houses, you can still find them. A few of those 50-foot columns, a piece of a garden wall, the shell of a fountain, silent stone fragments, standing in the grass, the last surviving pieces of the biggest mansion America ever built, and then chose to erase. Ned Stotesbury raised that house to outlast the palaces of kings. It did not outlast him by 50 years, and that, perhaps, is the strangest part of the whole story. Stranger even than how they built it. Because those ruins in the grass are not the only thing the Gilded Age left behind on hilltops like this one. There were other palaces, other fortunes, other men who built monuments they were certain would stand forever. And what happened to them next is a story of its own.